Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otap, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Bombs and drones. Cowards, weak links, fight from your towers and precincts. Showers of flowers your deeds bring. Might think you safe, but your power's deceiving. What crime did the kid commit besides being born in a place years of fix, where even playing football with your peers a risk? We done cried so hard that our tears are missed. Deaf, dumb, blind, check one time. Blowing up, all we do is step on lines. You might live boldly, taking innocent souls in this abode, but you should know that death's unkind. You can't defeat the faith, we peep the hate. The world is watching, see the rate you murder often season lakes of perfume, cause them goons love death like you love life.
Habari gani? This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Black August Saturday, August 2nd, 2024. The commemoration of Black August particularly hails the advances and sacrifices of Black freedom fighters. The Black August Los Angeles upcoming calendar events. Please grab a pen if you need to mark these dates. First, Wednesday, August 7th from 6 to 9 p.m. is the Jonathan Jackson Youth Day event at Chuco's Justice Center. The month of August gains special significance and importance in the Black liberation movement, beginning with a courageous attempt by Jonathan Jackson to demand the freedom of political prisoners and prisoners of war, of which the Soledad Brothers' case brought to the center of attention. Then, Wednesday, August 21st at 7 p.m. is the celebration of life of G2 Siddiqui at Chuco's Justice Center. Our beloved elder comrade G2 was also a co-host of KPFK's prison radio program Think Outside the Cage. He was a powerful and beautiful mentor to us, and such a fierce warrior of liberation, education, and love for his people. Come join us to honor his life. Then, the 2024 Black August LA Martyrs Tour is happening on Saturday, August 24th. The tour bus meets at Chuco's Justice Center at 11 a.m. and departs at noon. For questions, please email blackaugustla@gmail.com. That's one word together, blackaugustla@gmail.com. Our agenda for today's program covers policing during Jim Crow and Sudan. We commence with our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Jeffrey S. Adler, professor of history at the University of Florida in Gainesville and author of the book Bluecoated Terror, Jim Crow and the Roots of Modern Police Brutality. And the second half of the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Christopher Tounsel, associate professor of history at the University of Washington at Seattle, and author of the book Bounds of Blackness, African Americans, Sudan, and the Politics of Solidarity. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Slum Prophecy, who you're listening to now, the track Blood of the Martyrs, produced by historian Professor Butch Ware. And also this hour, music by Eric Dolphy, Miles Davis, Alice Coltrane, Sudanese classical music, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
Freedom or death?
Sister Luyanda Koboka with this week's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at KPFK 90.7 FM and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. August 8th, early 18th century. Nanny Griggs, a literate Barbadian African freedom fighter, on the Simons Plantation in the Caribbean organizes a militant corps of slaves, which were linked to similar groups throughout the island. The militants led by Nanny led a slave rebellion that was briefly successful. August 9th, 1956. 20,000 African women marched in Pretoria, South Africa, to protest laws forcing them to carry passbooks, a tactical action in the overall struggle for Azania's liberation from the settler colonialism led by women. August 9th, 1966. The Chinese Communist Party launches the Cultural Revolution to purge China of remaining feudal and European cultural and ideological legacies in their continued march towards socialism. August 10th, 1945. Josina Michel, the founder of the women's wing of Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo, was born. Frelimo was the leading organization which led the political and military resistance to Portuguese colonialism and liberated African women and men from the brutal dictatorship of Portuguese imperialism. August 11th, 1968. American Indian Movement, founded in Minneapolis by Clyde and Vernon Belcourt and Dennis Bank, AIM, continues to be the vanguard pan-Native American movement which seeks the liberation of Native Americans from European capitalist domination. August 11th, 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois, Monroe Trotter, and others meet in Canada to organize the Niagara Movement, the precursor to the NAACP. The statement, "We refuse to allow the impression to remain that the Negro American assents to inferiority, is submissive under oppression, and apologetic before insults." August 11th, 1965. The Watts Rebellion occurred. A contemporary African resistance movement, though disorganized, had a focus against police brutality and the dreadful conditions facing Africans and other members of the unemployed, working class, and people of color. August 12, 1976. 3,000 Palestinians massacred at Tal al-Zafar, Beirut, by the Phalanges and Zionist forces in the continued onslaught against Palestinian struggle for self-determination and the right to their homeland, what is mislabeled Israel. August 13th, 1926. Fidel Castro, the embodiment of the Cuban Revolution, was born. Every U.S. president from Dwight Eisenhower in 1959 to the present-day baby Bush, 12 U.S. presidents who have sworn to overthrow the socialist state off the coast of Florida. Subcomandante Fidel has outlasted them all due to the power of the people in defending the socialist gains of Cuba. David versus Goliath class. This has been a brief overview of some of the historical struggle of Africans and the oppressed against all forms of exploitations, whether slavery, feudalism, capitalism, or imperialism. We should gain strength and motivation from the historical truism that wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Today, the twin evils of the United States and Israel imperialism, two settler colonies, are our new targets, and as with all empires, they will inevitably collapse. Join us in our freedom chant of Amandla Awetu, which means the power belongs to the masses, not the rich. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jeffrey S. Adler, Professor of History at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and author of the book Bluecoated Terror, Jim Crow and the Roots of Modern Police Brutality. thank you for joining us on KPFK Los Angeles Freedom Now, Professor Adler.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Well, I had just completed a book on murder in early 20th century New Orleans. And although the principal theme was not policing, I noticed some really puzzling changes, excuse me, in police violence. And then I began to dig deeper into the topic with the awful murder of George Floyd for a class I was teaching. And two things struck me and led me to consider writing the book. One is that I read that for a few decades now, the police homicide rate in the United States has been 100 times the rate in the United Kingdom. We're not 100 times more anything really than the United Kingdom. We are more violent, but only by a factor of 3 or 4. There's virtually no measure that of the same magnitude as police killings in the United States. And then I became frustrated with some of the coverage of police brutality in the early 2020s, because what I heard really smart, thoughtful commentators argue is either that this has always been the case, which is simply not true, and I'll give you some evidence of that. And the other thing I heard was that it was the opposite end of the spectrum, that it was a new phenomenon, that with Michael Brown or Eric Garner, a new era of police violence began. And that was also untrue. And what I had kind of skimmed across, touched the surface of in my book on murder in early 20th century New Orleans was that policing in New Orleans, and then I looked at cities like Memphis and Atlanta and found the same pattern, became more racialized in the interwar era. The proportion of murders of African American suspects by the police increased dramatically. During the 1920s and 1930s, for example, the proportion of African Americans killed by white civilians fell by 2/3, and the proportion killed by the police increased by roughly 2/3. And that the police on African American homicide rate went from being relatively low to tripling. And what I found was that the earlier police were not racially blind. They were not just or fair toward African American suspects, but the burden of racial control was largely shouldered by white civilians in all of these cities in the South at the beginning of the 20th century. And that by the 1920s and the 1930s, that had shifted. And suddenly, fairly rapidly, actually, race control and crime control overlapped, and it became part of the mandate, the mission of the police to control race relations, something that was largely done by white popular justice in earlier eras. And that this became widely accepted. It became expected within white society, within the legal establishment, within the political establishment. And this is all set to the backdrop of African Americans being largely disfranchised. You know, by the 1930s, African Americans were a third of the population of New Orleans, and comparable figures in all these other cities, and less than 1% of voters. So political authority and legal authority was over 99% statistically in the hands of whites. And with the great migration of African Americans, first to southern cities and then by the 19-teens and 1920s across the nation to northern cities, suddenly crime became allied, became connected, became associated with African Americans, and the police became the guardians of law and order and the guardians of the rule of law, and that white voters wanted that, white courts wanted that, white judges wanted that, almost in an unthinking way. And the result is that it became kind of baked in, built in, embedded in the authority, the mandate, the mission of the municipal police. And with that, white voters and white political authorities began to expect the police to exercise essentially rough justice, violent justice, in controlling a scary, demonized African American population. And they broadened the discretion given to police officers to use force to do so. So every measure I could find of police violence indicated this shift very quickly in the 1920s and 1930s, where it was something that the police did, and they did it because white voters and white political authorities wanted it. And that led to kind of two wider developments. One is as African Americans in the Great Migration moved to northern cities and western cities, Chicago and Columbus and Cleveland and Los Angeles, this fear of African Americans and crime increased, and this same sort of Jim Crow policing model became embedded 20, 25, 30 years later in all of those cities. And the same process unfolded, where the police gained great authority to use force, and that force was disproportionately directed against African American suspects. And social psychologists in the last 20 years have done really interesting research that has argued that when citizens broadly defined believe that the police are serving their needs, their interests, they're quick to expand police authority to support aggressive policing under certain circumstances. So the result is that there was a kind of hand-in-glove connection between police officers beating up African American suspects, shooting unarmed African Americans, using violent interrogation tactics to elicit confessions from African American suspects. And as that all unfolded, white political muscle endorsed racialized policing. And again, it became kind of built in. The definition of the rule of law permitted it. And law and order, and we certainly saw this we've seen this in the last 10 years. For many Americans, law and order is coded language. It means be really tough on the people perceived to be dangerous, and they are disproportionately imagined, depicted as African American. And the result is that a process that began with the Great Migration early in the 20th century has become more and more built in, embedded in the definition of good professional policing. There are factors that reinforce that. Every time there's been a particular panic about African Americans and social order, social stability. Police muscle has increased. We saw that in response to the 1960s racial turmoil, where SWAT teams, which were not new, but they expanded dramatically, were created in virtually every city and emerged as a kind of symbol of good, tough policing. And we also see, if we look at the 1960s, 50s, really, 60s and 70s, is that the police were consulting and working very closely with the Defense Department, and urban police departments were institutionalizing some of the counter-subversion measures used in Asia and Africa against communists and radicals and others, also based on the assumption that these certain elements of society are dangerous in the name of social stability, in the name of the rule of law, in the name of law and order, have to be controlled, have to be managed. And all of those things are creating increasing momentum, and the awful, vicious murders of Laquan McDonald and Eric Garner and obviously George Floyd reflect that, and they're stunning. There's really jarring, shocking continuity in how the legal system has responded. In the era that I look at in this book, which is the interwar era, 0% of New Orleans police officers who killed African Americans, often disproportionately unarmed suspects, were exonerated or acquitted. And the figures, at least of felony charges, and the figures in modern America are 1%, roughly 1 to 2% of the police officers who kill African American suspects are convicted of felony. That's roughly 1,000 cases a year. And they cover a wide spectrum, but it's unimaginable that 99% of the cases were absolutely consistent with law and order, but it reflects the way in which this definition of a threat posed by African Americans and the preservation of social order slide together and shape what's expected of police officers who are sometimes in a really difficult situation, where the people who control the courts and control the ballot box are defining for them what law and order means and who it applies to. And it was that kind of confluence of factors that led me to think about the project. And then a wonderful editor at the University of California Press approached me as I'm kind of wrestling with these topics and asked if I'd be interested in writing a book on it. And that's what led to Bluecoated Terror.
Now, sadly, we're rapidly running out of time, Professor Adler. But let me ask you this. You were quite critical of Euro-American public opinion with regard to how this process was launched and was continued. And I'm wondering, was there any dissent within this community? Was there a multiracial left that perhaps dissented but was overwhelmed, for example?
There was. I mean, that's a terrific question. There were indeed African American civil rights groups. There were African American religious groups. And there were a small number of white New Orleanians who were deeply committed to social justice. And they all objected strenuously to these trends. The trends were obvious. No one denied them. In fact, The city crowed about them, boasted about them, but they were demonized. That critics of this were perceived as fellow travelers of radicals and criminals. And the result is that they received death threats. They were harassed by the police. And this is the period that I focus on in the book, the 1920s and 30s and 40s. The CIO and some more radical labor organizations were also strident supporters of social justice who objected to all of this. And the police folded them into the category of subversives as dangers. And even the state legislature publicly championed the aggressive efforts by New Orleans cops to control all these dangerous groups. And it's sort of, in a lot of ways, it's easy to dismiss the people I'm writing about as relics of a long ago era. But again, political scientists and social psychologists have found really unsettlingly similar issues in modern America. For example, after 9/11, and this isn't exactly the same, but there's some parallels that are chilling. After 9/11, the majority of Americans, if asked if torture of suspects is permissible, they would say no. After 9/11, at least in the short run, the vast majority of Americans said that the torture, the use of waterboarding, aggressive techniques against suspected terrorists were perfectly fine. And political scientists have said the same thing happened in the treatment of communists during the Cold War. Well, all that's magnified with the toxic racial climate that has sort of ebbed and flowed in American society. And that means that the narrow exceptions on the use of torture of suspects that Americans accept have been, for the most part, accepted against a huge segment of American citizens, that is, people of color and especially African Americans.
Well, Professor Adler, author of the book Bluecoated Terror, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you again. Goodbye.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Christopher Tounsel, Associate Professor of History at the University of Washington in Seattle, and author of the book Bounds of Blackness, African Americans, Sudan, and the Politics of Solidarity. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Townsel.
And thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for having me. It is truly an honor to be in conversation with you.
And ditto, the feeling is mutual. So why did you write this book, Bounds of Blackness?
Absolutely. So Bounds of Blackness is actually my second book, but my first book also deals with the Sudan. And so as an African American, there were kind of really interesting moments in the writing of my first book, which is about kind of Christianity and political imagination in South Sudan, where African Americans were coming up in the archival record. And so I definitely had kind of a personal interest in writing this book because I wanted to know kind of the genealogy that I was a part of, right? I know that Sudan and Egypt have always played a very important role in Black American consciousness, but that so much has kind of been approached through the lens of the ancient Nile. But I knew I couldn't be the first Black person, from the States to, have traveled to the Sudan and have been interested in kind of post-colonial Sudan. So that's really why I wanted to write this book. So, yeah, definitely a personal investment, but one that I kind of wanted to just expand our historical understandings of how Black Americans have made sense of the Nile.
And of course, your book is quite expansive, stretching over decades, but you also have information on the relationship of Black American thinkers and thinking yesterday and today to Nubia and Kush. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. So the ancient kingdoms of Nubia and Kush existed, thousands of years ago, both in kind of the before Common Era and Common Era periods. And they were located south of the modern state of Egypt. So Nubia and Kush kind of existed in southern Egypt, northern Sudan, and even extending further southeast into Ethiopia, right? And so there's a way in which, dating back to the 19th century, African American thinkers looked to ancient Kush and ancient Nubia as examples of a kind of Black glory and Black royalty, Black excellence that predated transatlantic slavery, right? And so there's a way in which the kingdoms of ancient Kush and ancient Nubia, for people like, Carter G. Woodson, Du Bois, were kind of proof, right, that, the colloquialism, we used to be kings and queens, right? And so within a context of, a white supremacist kind of teaching that, Black people had no history, were basically, created by God to be servile and kind of all of those tropes and things, figures like Nefertiti, right? Figures like the Black pharaohs that once ruled over Egypt were used to counter this racist narrative, right? And so to this day, right, we know that if you walk into certain kind of Pan-African bookstores or, I'll say stores that sell, Afrocentric garb, right? You'll see a lot of the symbolism from ancient Kush and Nubia available for Black Americans to either purchase and or otherwise engage, right? So, the relationship with the ancient Nile is in no ways a kind of relic of the past. It absolutely continues to the present day. And I think that, we saw recently, right, with the Netflix docu-series on Cleopatra, right, that this is still a very politically charged kind of issue, right? That you have people both in this country and in Egypt, right, who are very much concerned, right, with kind of what the heritage of the ancient Nile means today. Whose heritage is it really, right? So I hope that answers your question or helps to.
Well, certainly. And of course, about 120 odd years ago, there was a plan cooked up in part by Booker T. Washington, the then leading Negro leader, to ship thousands of Black Americans and families to Sudan. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So at the turn of the 20th century, right, when Sudan is kind of in the infancy of its existence as an Anglo-Egyptian colony, right, it is found that Sudan has incredible economic potential in cotton, right? And so Booker T. Washington walks alongside this kind of white agricultural tycoon named Leigh Hunt, and he sends a group of Tuskegee students to the Sudan, essentially to, help, walk alongside and teach local Sudanese about cotton cultivation, right? But, as you well know, of course, the turn of the 20th century was a venerable hellscape for many African Americans, right? We're just talking about, 2 generations removed from emancipation. Jim Crow is alive and well, right? The kind of statistical peak of lynching, right, is at the turn of the 20th century. And so there are a lot of conversations going on in Black newspapers about, should we basically repatriate, right? And so you had conversations about, places like Liberia, the Philippines being used as places where Black people could basically find safe refuge from Jim Crow. And so with the colonization of the Sudan, and with kind of, this Tuskegee project to send Black agriculturalists over there, Sudan kind of enters this kind of global discussion, right, about possible countries that Black people can move to. And we know that it's not just Black people having this conversation, right? One Egyptian newspaper, right? And, of course, pardon my my language here, but, one Egyptian newspaper refers to Sudan as, potentially a inward Canaan, right? A kind of place where, hundreds of thousands of Black people could find their proverbial promised land, right? Free from white supremacy. Obviously, this never happens, right? It is really based in, conjecture and rumor. And at one point, even when Booker T is directly asked about this, he responds, "No, I believe that America is the best place for the Negro," right? Nevertheless, right, it does speak to kind of the sentiment of the turn of the 20th century, how bad things were for Black people in this country, and the idea that Sudan, right, thousands of miles removed, not just from the United States, but also the kind of, ancestral, if you will, West and Central African origins of many Black peoples, Sudan being a potential promised land. And of course, we know that this rhetoric of Africa as a kind of promised land or place of repatriation gets continually picked up and gains steam into the 1920s with folks like Marcus Garvey.
Now, speaking of Cairo, we know that from the end of the 19th century up into independence in 1956, there was a kind of Anglo-Egyptian condominium ruling over Sudan. And in that context, can you talk about Sudan as a hunting ground for the enslaved, particularly by Egyptians and the previous colonial master, speaking of Turkey or Turkiya?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what's very interesting is that, going back thousands of years, people in Egypt, of course, not all people, but there was a very ancient slave trade, right, that involved basically raiding lands south of Egypt, and then, of course, sending them up north to places like Cairo, and then further east into the Middle East. And so during the kind of Egyptian, Turkish period, and I'll just, kind of focus on, the 75 years before Sudan becomes the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. Certainly the Ottoman rulers of Egypt looked to the Sudan as essentially being a place of slaves, right? A place where they could capture slaves to fill the Egyptian army, right? And so you had slave raids that were infamous, right? That took place involving Egyptians and Turks in the Sudan, right? And so once Sudan becomes the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, right, in 1899, Black newspapers really shine a light on this kind of extractive and exploitative history, right? With figures like Joel Rogers, a very famous Black newspaper reporter who I know, Dr. Horne, you are familiar with, really talking about kind of the history of Sudan being oppressed by their Arab neighbors to the north. And so there's this really kind of interesting, discursive dichotomy made between Sudan as being Black and Egypt as being Arab, right? Sudan as oppressed, Egypt as oppressor, right? And so there's this kind of really interesting way in which Black newspapers like, the Pittsburgh Courier, are really highlighting Sudan as this place of oppression, right? And in no insignificant way, right? Sudan as a place that, that somewhat parallels, if you will, the African American experience. You have Black newspapers talking about people in Sudan basically living in their own type of Jim Crow once they moved to Cairo, right? The fact that, Sudanese in Cairo would be forced to kind of work in, the, service industries and things of that nature. And so there's a way in which if someone were in, Pittsburgh circa 1938 and they're reading about Cairo, they would be exposed to an understanding of, oh, Sudanese know what we have to go through here, and we have a lens into what they have to go through there, right? And so in my book, I talk about how the kind of, interwar period and kind of really the 1920s all the way up to the early 1950s, right? There's a way in which Sudan is repeatedly framed as a Black African colony being oppressed by racial others. But what's really interesting, of course, is that the racial others in this paradigm are not only the white Europeans, aka the English, but also Arab Egyptians. And so I think that this kind of adds a bit of texture into kind of historical understandings of Afro-Arab solidarity, right? And so I'm not in any ways arguing that Afro-Arab solidarity is not real and is not, deeply historically rooted. But it is to say that in the Sudan, we see, some language, at least that circulates in Black newspapers, that could be used to complicate and even undermine a sense that Afro-Arab solidarity during the colonial period and early post-colonial period was a kind of universal phenomenon, because it certainly was not when it comes to the Sudan.
Now, despite that identification by Black Americans with Sudan, when Sudan surges to independence in 1956, apparently it's downplayed, even to this day. When Black Americans think of post-colonial Africa, they point to 1957 and the independence of Ghana. How do you explain that apparent conundrum?
Exactly. Yes, it is a conundrum indeed. And to your point, it continues to the present day. And there are textbooks published by respected presses that perpetuate, I'll just say, the misinformation that Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African, former colony to achieve independence. To answer your question, I think there are multiple reasons, right? One is the fact that Sudan occupies a crossroads in many ways, right? To this day, and I talk about this in the introduction, Sudan is sometimes considered to be sub-Saharan African, sometimes North African, right? But then there's also this Hegelian propensity to really consider sub-Saharan Africa as completely black, right? And Sudan, in many ways, I would argue is like the Louisiana of Africa in the sense that it is, the kind of geographic location of a confluence of races, ethnicities, languages, histories, right? It is kaleidoscopic. And so because Ghana and Nigeria and Ivory Coast, right, occupy West Africa, which is obviously the place that, the vast majority of people of African descent who ended up in North and South America came from, there is a way in which West Africa conceptually is more readily identified as being black than certain other geographic locations in Africa, right? And I think that, the overlooking of Sudanese independence in 1956 and the heavy focus on Ghanaian independence in 1957 only serves to perpetuate that. But I think that there are some other reasons as well, right? Of course, Ghana is the kind of political epicenter, if you will, of, Pan-Africanism, of course, the Black Star and the connections with Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah, right? So a lot of it, I would argue, is the result of really calculated marketing, right? But also, the fact that Ghana is conceptually understood by a lot of African Americans as being black by virtue of the fact that many of us in the States today who identify as black, can trace our ancestry in some way, shape, or form back to countries like Ghana, Ivory Coast, so on and so forth.
Now, in recent years, Sudan has surged into the headlines once again, in the United States at least. The crisis in Darfur, Western Sudan, and of course the independence, the secession of South Sudan, circa 2011, from the larger Sudan. And you suggest that these conflicts led to splits or fissures between and amongst Black American Christians on the one hand and Black American Muslims on the other. How so?
Absolutely. And I think this is really where the politics of solidarity really kick into high gear, right? So in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, right, Sudan is ruled as an official Islamic republic, right? And so there is a way in which the Nation of Islam was able to foster an incredibly close relationship with the Sudanese government during this time. Louis Farrakhan traveled to Khartoum on multiple occasions, right, and met with Omar al-Bashir, who, by the mid-1990s was already kind of becoming an international pariah because Sudan had basically hosted Osama bin Laden. And while this was pre-9/11, of course, Osama bin Laden was already on the U.S. government's radar by virtue of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So that's just to say that while Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president, was in charge of the country, Louis Farrakhan has a close relationship with folks like him, Muammar Gaddafi, right? And some other world's leaders that the State Department was not necessarily, cozy with, right? But when the genocide in Darfur happens, right, in the early 2000s, where you've got 300,000 Black African people slaughtered, right, by Janjaweed militias that were basically supported and funded by Omar al-Bashir, Louis Farrakhan's, allegiance to the Sudanese government, of course, is even brought into further light. So there's a way in which the Nation of Islam looks at Sudan and kind of uses Sudan as an example to say, here, the Western media is demonizing this country because they are Muslims, right? And so, we are basically going to be friends with Sudan because they are victims, right? The Western media is demonizing this country on account of their being Muslims and they're being ruled by an Arab government, right? But on the other side, right, you have hundreds of thousands of Sudanese who are Christians and who identify as Black. And we know that enslavement was used as a weapon of war in the Second Sudanese Civil War, which takes place from 1983 to 2005. And so you have folks like T.D. Jakes, Al Sharpton, who are very quick to shine a light on the plight of Black South Sudanese Christians, right? Excuse me. So it becomes this really interesting moment where you've got the Nation of Islam, right? The largest contingent of Black Muslims in this country, and a lot of mainline Protestant Christians, right, on the other side of the spectrum, basically taking different sides, if you will, when it comes to or came to approaches to Sudan, right? And so in what is, I believe, the 5th chapter of my book, I talk about this, right? This kind of interesting way in which Sudan becomes a nation that a lot of Black Americans are really interested in the 1990s and 2000s, but that it is not a monolithic support, and that the kind of key difference in terms of who took sides with whom was religion, right? And so it becomes this kind of perfect storm of how does religion basically strengthen or undermine Black solidarity, right? Because Black folks, as we know, are spiritual people, right? And we have very strong relationships with our faith communities. And so when does kind of that religious sentiment or religious identification strengthen or undermine a kind of transnational Black solidarity, right? So that's what my 5th chapter talks about.
Finally, Professor Christopher Tounsel, Associate Professor of History, University of Washington, Seattle, author of the book Bounds of Blackness. Sudan is in the headlines again today. The conflict ostensibly between the military on the one hand and a wing of the military, the so-called Rapid Support Forces on the other. Headlines about famine, stories about external interference, again from Egypt, United Arab Emirates. Does your book shed any light, perhaps, on the current controversy, the current conflict in Sudan?
I think it does, to the extent that I think that the book shows how powerful African American awareness of Sudan has been, and how African Americans have operated as an incredibly influential bloc that can pressure the United States government in terms of how it responds to crises in the Sudan. And so I think that there's a way in which, I talk about how Black Americans really since 2011 have been at the forefront of U.S.-Sudan relations, right? But I think that it relates to the present day conflict in this sense, right? It talks about kind of the seeds of the conflict, but I think anyone reading my book should ask themselves the question, well, how are Black Americans approaching the conflict now, right? What are groups like the NAACP, the Nation of Islam, kind of Black national civic organizations, how are we responding to the conflict? And if not, why not, right? I think there's a way in which right now there is a kind of exhaustion with the Sudan, right? Because the Save Darfur movement was so big, right? But Sudan has increasingly become synonymous in the Western media with this place of chaos, corruption, warlords, right? Yet and still, right, we know that African Americans continue to be a very conscious political bloc when it comes to the entire continent of Africa. And so my hope is that people reading the book, would not engage in kind of a self-condemnation, right? But, ask kind of an honest question, what is the state of kind of Black American consciousness of contemporary Africa, right? Beyond Black Panther, right? Beyond, potentially rooting for African teams at the Olympics, right? Beyond, the kind of emotional connections with the continent, practically speaking, right? What do, someone like right? Associate professor who teaches Black history, like, what am I doing? What are Black newspapers or, Black bloggers or Black Twitter, right? How are we talking about Sudan? How are we making sure that the world doesn't overlook Sudan in favor of Ukraine and Gaza, which are obviously both very important as well? But Black Americans have shown an incredible propensity throughout our history to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And we can kind of, keep tabs on multiple things, multiple pressing human rights crises at the same time. So I think that people reading my book will certainly get an historical sense of the background of what's going on in Darfur today. But I think anyone reading the book will also hopefully ask themselves the question, well, okay, how are Black Americans engaging with this crisis in the Sudan that is so underreported, right, on news in favor of other contemporary crises?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Tounsel, author of the book Bounds of Blackness. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
And thank you so much for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Professor Jeffrey Adler, Professor Christopher Tounsel. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell. Thank you, Mark Maxwell, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our Sister Assumpta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.